I want to be honest about something before I start. When people ask me how I survived the first month, they expect a story about fighting, about close calls and narrow escapes, and decisions made in split seconds that separated the living from the dead. And there are some of those. But mostly, the first month was about arithmetic. Miles per gallon, gallons remaining, hours of daylight, calories in a can of pinto beans, square footage of a Kenworth W990 sleeper cab, which is about 82 square feet if you don't count the storage compartments, and about 91 if you do. I counted the storage compartments. I counted everything. Counting was how I kept the panic at a distance long enough to do the next thing that needed doing. My name is Cleland Royce. Most people called me Clee, which rhymes with clay. I was 44 years old when the world stopped making sense, and I had been driving long-haul freight for 19 of those years. Before that, I did 4 years in the Army as a 91B, wheeled vehicle mechanic. And before that, I grew up in Ider, Alabama, a town so small that its only real export was people leaving it. I left at 18, and I never went back. Which is a whole other kind of story, but it's not this one. The truck was a 2021 Kenworth W990 with a 76-inch mid-roof sleeper. I didn't own it. It belonged to Hargill Freight Solutions out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and I was leased on as an owner-operator, which in practice meant I made the payments, Hargill took the profit, and the bank owned everything. The sleeper had a single bunk, 40 inches wide, with a 3-inch foam mattress over a plywood platform. Below the bunk were 2 storage bins. Opposite the bunk was a narrow counter with a microwave bolted to the wall above it, a 12-volt refrigerator the size of a small cooler, and a cabinet that held whatever I'd bought from the last truck stop, usually ramen cups, Vienna sausages, crackers, and a bag of apples. There was a fold-down desk where I kept my logbook and a Bluetooth speaker. A curtain separated the sleeper from the driving compartment. The whole thing smelled like diesel, old coffee, and the particular staleness that comes from a grown man living in a space not much bigger than a walk-in closet. That was my world when everything started. I was hauling a load of electrical transformers from a Siemens distribution center outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, to a utility substation in Dalton, Georgia. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesdays were when my daughter Bree called. She was 22, living in Chattanooga, working as a dental hygienist, and she called every Tuesday at 7:15 in the evening, which was the only time her schedule and mine reliably overlapped. I was on I-40 westbound, about 30 miles east of Asheville, when the radio started going strange. The first thing I noticed was that the country station I'd been half listening to cut out mid-song and was replaced by an EAS tone. Emergency Alert System. I'd heard plenty of those, severe thunderstorm warnings mostly, and the occasional flash flood. But this one was different. The automated voice said something about a CDC advisory for 6 counties in Virginia and asked residents to shelter in place pending further instruction. It didn't say why. Then the music came back, and I forgot about it within 5 minutes. The second thing happened about an hour later, on the downhill stretch past Black Mountain. My CB radio, which I usually kept on channel 19 out of habit more than necessity, started picking up chatter that didn't sound like the usual truckers, complaining about speed traps and lot lizards. A guy with a handle I didn't recognize was talking fast, too fast, about something he'd seen at a rest area near Marion. He said there were state troopers blocking the eastbound on-ramp, and an ambulance parked sideways across the shoulder with its lights on, but nobody in it. Someone else told him to quit making up stories. Then a third voice, calmer, said he'd seen the same thing at a way station in Tennessee, and that the troopers were wearing masks. Not COVID masks, gas masks. I turned the CB up. For the next 40 minutes, the chatter got thicker and stranger. Reports of highway closures. Reports of hospitals turning people away. One driver said National Guard trucks were moving east on I-81 in a convoy. Another said his dispatcher had told everyone to park and stay parked. No explanation given. I tried calling Hargill's dispatch line. The phone rang 11 times and nobody answered, which had never happened before in 19 years. I pulled into a pilot station outside of Asheville to fuel up. The station was crowded, more trucks than usual, and a lot of four-wheelers parked haphazardly, people going in and out of the convenience store with armfuls of water and snacks. The atmosphere was wrong. That's the best way I can describe it. It was like the air before a bad storm, except the sky was clear. People were looking at their phones and then looking at each other and not saying anything. I fueled up, both tanks, 150 gallons each, 300 gallons total, and went inside to pay and use the restroom. The television behind the counter was on CNN. I stood there for 6 minutes and watched, and what I saw didn't make sense. There were aerial shots of a highway somewhere. The Chiron said Interstate 66 in Virginia. Completely gridlocked, and between the cars there were people running. Not from anything visible, just running. The anchor was using words like unconfirmed reports and aggressive behavior and CDC is advising caution. Nobody in the store was talking. We were all just standing there, watching, and I think every one of us was doing the same calculation. How far am I from home, and how fast can I get there? I tried calling Bree. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. I texted her. Call me when you can. Watching the news. Are you okay? Then I bought everything useful that was left on the shelves. 4 gallons of water, 2 boxes of granola bars, a bag of beef jerky, 2 cans of Sterno, a roll of duct tape, and a prepaid phone card, which was a stupid purchase in retrospect, but felt rational at the time. I went back to my truck and sat in the driver's seat and tried Bree again. Voicemail. I should have driven straight to Chattanooga. I know that now. It was about 4 hours from where I was, maybe less without traffic. But I didn't know yet what was happening. Nobody did. And I had a load on. 43,000 pounds of electrical transformers that were due in Dalton by Thursday morning. And my contract with Hargill had a penalty clause for late delivery. And I was 2 payments behind on the truck. That's the thing about the end of the world. It doesn't announce itself clearly enough to override the way your brain has been trained to think about money and deadlines and penalties. So I pulled out of the pilot station and got back on I-40 West, heading toward Dalton, which was roughly the right direction for Chattanooga anyway, telling myself I'd deliver the load and then drive up to see Bree. I made it about 60 miles before the highway stopped. Not closed, not barricaded, just stopped. Traffic ahead of me slowed, and then thickened, and then congealed into a solid mass of vehicles stretching as far as I could see from the elevated cab. I was near the Tennessee line, in the mountains, on a stretch of interstate with no exits for several miles in either direction. I sat there for 45 minutes. The CB was chaos. Everyone talking over everyone else. No information, just fear transmuted into noise. I tried my phone. No signal. The towers were either overloaded or down. At some point during that 45 minutes, I saw the first one. It was on the shoulder, about 200 yards ahead and to my right. A person, a man, I think, though it was hard to tell from that distance. He was walking, but not the way people walk. The gait was wrong. Too stiff through the hips, too loose through the shoulders, like the top half and bottom half of his body were being operated by different people. He walked into the median cable barrier and didn't stop, just pressed against it, leaning, feet still moving, until he sort of tipped over it and fell into the grass on the other side. Then he got up and kept walking in the same direction, into the eastbound lanes, which were mostly empty. A woman in the SUV next to me rolled down her window and said, "Did you see that?" I said yes. She said, "What's wrong with him?" I said I didn't know. She rolled her window back up. 40 minutes after that, the gridlock broke. Not because the obstruction cleared, but because people started driving on the shoulder and through the median. I followed. The truck handled the median grass badly, lurching and shuddering, but the ground was dry and firm enough. I got back on the westbound lanes past whatever had caused the stoppage. I never saw what it was, and drove. The next 3 hours were the strangest driving I've ever done. The highway was intermittently passable. Long stretches of empty road punctuated by clusters of abandoned vehicles that I had to navigate around, sometimes by going off-road entirely. The CB was mostly dead now. My phone had no signal. The radio stations were either off the air or playing the same EAS loop on repeat. I passed 2 accidents, both involving multiple cars, both with no emergency response anywhere in sight. I passed a rest area where the parking lot was full and people were standing outside their cars staring at the tree line, and I didn't stop. I passed a billboard for a church that someone had spray painted over with the words, "God has left," in red letters so large I could read them from a quarter-mile away. I didn't make it to Dalton. About 20 miles east of Knoxville, the highway was completely impassable. A jackknife tanker across both lanes and a pileup of maybe 30 vehicles behind it, some of them still burning. I could feel the heat through the windshield from 500 feet back. I stopped, and I sat, and I thought. Chattanooga was about 2 hours south, but the route would take me through Knoxville, and whatever was happening seemed worst in the cities. I tried Bree again. No signal. I tried Hargill Dispatch. No signal. I tried 911. No signal. I was alone in a 73,000-pound vehicle on a highway that no longer functioned, and my daughter was somewhere I couldn't reach, and the world was ending in a way I couldn't name yet. That was when I made the decision that, looking back, probably saved my life. I didn't try to push through to Chattanooga. I didn't abandon the truck and go on foot. I pulled off the interstate at the last exit I'd passed, a rural 2-lane road that my GPS, which still worked on satellite signal even without cell service, told me led to a town called Del Rose. I drove 3 miles down that road until I found a wide gravel pull-off next to a cattle gate, backed the truck in so the cab faced the road, and stopped. Then I climbed into the sleeper, pulled the curtain shut, and didn't come out for 14 hours. I need to describe the sleeper in more detail, because for the next 30 days, it was my entire life. The bunk was against the back wall, running the width of the cab. The mattress was covered with a sleeping bag I'd owned for 6 years, and a wool blanket my mother had given me before she died. Under the bunk were 2 storage compartments with hinged lids. One held my clothes, the other my tools and some spare parts. Opposite the bunk was the counter, about 18 inches deep, with the microwave above and the mini-fridge below. The cabinet next to it had a sliding door and 3 shelves. There was a narrow floor space between the bunk and the counter, about 22 inches wide, where I could stand if I hunched slightly. The ceiling was about 6 feet at the peak. I'm 5'11", so I could stand upright only in the center. There was 1 window on each side of the sleeper, small, tinted, with curtains I could Velcro shut. The rear wall had no window. The whole space smelled like me, like diesel, like the pine air freshener dangling from the mirror up front that hadn't smelled like pine in months. That first night, I lay on the bunk and listened. The silence was the most disorienting thing. On a normal night parked at a truck stop, there's a constant soundscape. Other trucks idling, refrigeration units cycling, doors slamming, the distant hiss of air brakes. Here there was nothing. Just crickets, and once, far away, something that might have been a scream or might have been a fox. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about Bree, and tried to calculate whether she was safer in Chattanooga or whether I should have gone to her. And the calculation looped and never resolved. In the morning, I took inventory. This is what I had. 300 gallons of diesel in the truck's tanks. The W990 gets about 6 miles per gallon loaded, maybe 7.5 empty. Loaded, that was 1,800 miles of range. If I dropped the trailer, closer to 2,200. The APU, auxiliary power unit, could run off the main tanks and burned roughly a gallon per hour, giving me heat, air conditioning, and electrical power to charge devices without running the main engine. Food: 4 gallons of water, 6 ramen cups, a can of Vienna sausages, a bag of beef jerky, 2 boxes of granola bars, 12 bars each, a sleeve of saltine crackers, 3 cans of sterno, and 2 apples. Maybe 5 days' worth of calories if I rationed hard. Tools: a 21-piece socket set, a tire iron, a pair of channel locks, a flashlight with extra batteries, a folding knife, a can of WD-40, a roll of duct tape, and the general assortment of things that accumulate in a truck over 19 years. Zip ties, bungee cords, rags, a half-empty bottle of hand sanitizer. Weapons: none, unless you counted the tire iron. I didn't own a gun. I'd carried one years ago, a Ruger LCP that fit in the center console, but I'd sold it during a tight stretch to make rent on an apartment I'd since given up. Communication: a cell phone with no signal and 30% battery, a CB radio, a satellite-connected GPS unit that showed maps but couldn't send or receive messages. I sat on the bunk with my logbook and wrote all of this down. Then I wrote down what I knew about the situation, which was almost nothing. Some kind of outbreak or event causing aggressive or abnormal behavior in people. Government response underway, but either insufficient or collapsing. Communications infrastructure failing. Highways becoming impassable. And the man on the shoulder, pressing into the cable barrier with his feet still moving. I didn't write the word zombie. I didn't think it yet. That came later. The first 3 days established a pattern that I would more or less follow for the rest of the month. During daylight, I drove, slowly, carefully, on secondary roads, avoiding interstates and towns of any real size. I was looking for 3 things: fuel, food, and information. At night, I parked in the most concealed spot I could find. Behind barns, in overgrown lots, on logging roads, and ran the APU on its lowest setting for heat and to keep the fridge cold. I kept the curtains shut and the cab dark. I didn't cook anything that would produce steam or smell. I ate cold food with my fingers and drank water in small sips, and used a wide-mouth Gatorade bottle for a urinal and sealed it with its cap between uses. On the second day, I dropped the trailer. This was a significant decision. 43,000 pounds of Siemens electrical transformers, expensive equipment, someone's critical infrastructure project, the obligation I'd been driving toward when the world intervened. I unhooked the glad hands, cranked the landing gear down, pulled the 5th wheel release, and drove out from under it in a church parking lot outside a town called Mosheim. The trailer sat there in the gravel like a monument to a delivery that would never happen. Without the trailer, the truck was faster, more maneuverable, and got better fuel economy. It also looked less like a target. An unloaded cab could be a truck that had already been stripped. A loaded trailer was a locked box that someone might want opened. On the third day, I found my first fuel. A farm supply store on the outskirts of a place called Bull's Gap had a bulk diesel tank on a raised platform behind the building. The store was open. The door was unlocked anyway, and empty. Not looted, just empty, as if everyone had left in the middle of a normal business day. The register was open, with cash still in the drawer. I took no money. I took a 5-gallon jerry can from the shelf, filled it from the bulk tank, and carried it back to the truck. Then I went back and filled it again. 5 trips, 25 gallons. It took about an hour, and the whole time I was exposed and terrified and listening for sounds I couldn't yet identify. Inside the store, I also took 2 cases of bottled water, a box of protein bars, a bag of dog food, which I never ate but kept as a last resort, a first aid kit, a hand crank flashlight, a package of chemical hand warmers, and a tarp. I left a note on the counter with my name and what I'd taken, which seems absurd now, but felt necessary at the time. Some part of my brain still believed that someone was keeping track, that there would be an accounting, that the old rules about taking things that didn't belong to you still applied. By the 4th day, I understood what was happening, because I'd seen more of them. The infected, the dead, whatever word you use. I'd seen a group of 7 standing in a field off the road, motionless, facing different directions, like broken weather vanes. I'd seen one walking along a drainage ditch in that stiff, wrong-jointed gait. I'd seen, from a distance of maybe 100 yards through the windshield, one crouched over something in a gas station parking lot. And I'd driven past without stopping, because the something had been wearing a red jacket and had arms and legs, and I didn't want to see anything else. They were dead people. They were dead people who moved. That's all I knew then. And honestly, it's most of what I know now. The mechanics of it, the biology, the cause, the transmission. I've heard theories and I've heard rumors, but I wasn't a scientist, and I wasn't near anyone who was. What I knew was operational. They moved slowly. They responded to sound more than sight. They were weaker individually than a living person, but didn't tire or hesitate. And they were everywhere. Not in vast hordes, not yet, but distributed across the landscape like a new kind of weather. You didn't drive into them. You drove through a place where some of them were, the way you drive through a county where it's raining. The sleeper cab, I realized, was almost perfectly suited to this. It was sealed. The doors locked. The windows were high off the ground. The cab floor was about 4 feet up, and small enough that nothing was climbing through them easily. The engine noise could attract attention. But when the engine was off and the APU was running on battery reserve, the truck was nearly silent. I could see out without being easily seen in. I could move when I needed to and hide when I needed to. And the transition between those 2 states took about 15 seconds. The problems were the ones you'd expect. Space, air, hygiene, sanity. Space first. 82 square feet sounds like a number until you live inside it. The bunk was where I slept, obviously, but it was also where I ate, where I sat to think, where I did the stretches and isometric exercises that kept my back from seizing up entirely. The floor was where I stood to change clothes, where I stacked supplies, where I crouched to reach the underbunk storage. The counter was where I prepared food, organized my inventory, and kept the things I needed fast access to. Flashlight, knife, first aid kit. Every surface had a function. Every object had a place. I developed a system within the first week, that was as rigid as any warehouse protocol I'd ever followed. Supplies organized by category in the storage bins. Water bottles arranged by date acquired, so I used the oldest first. Dirty clothes in a plastic bag wedged between the bunk and the wall. Clean clothes folded and stacked under the bunk with the tools. If I moved something and didn't put it back, I'd lose it. There was nowhere for it to go, but I'd lose it anyway. Because in a space that small, disorder compounds instantly. Air was harder. The sleeper had a small vent in the roof that I could crack open, but open vents were a risk. Sound travels through them, and so does scent, and I didn't know how sensitive the infected were to either. Most nights I kept it closed and breathed the same air until it felt thick and warm and tasted like my own lungs. I cracked the side windows sometimes, an inch at most, enough to feel a current without creating an opening. In the second week, when temperatures dropped, it was late October and I was in the foothills of the Appalachians. The cold air through those cracks was bitter enough that I had to choose between fresh air and warmth. I chose warmth and accepted the headaches. Hygiene was the thing I thought about least and suffered from most. I had no running water, no toilet, no shower. The Gatorade bottle system worked for urine, but for anything else I had to leave the cab, which meant assessing risk, finding a concealed spot, and doing what needed doing as fast as possible with my head on a swivel. I used hand sanitizer constantly until it ran out, then switched to the chemical hand wipes from the first aid kit, then to a damp rag that I rinsed with a few tablespoons of water. My clothes smelled. I smelled. The cab smelled. By the end of the second week, I'd gone nose-blind to my own odor, which was both a relief and a sign that I was losing calibration on other things too. Sanity. I'll come back to that. The fifth and sixth days were about fuel. I had learned from the Bulls Gap stop that ground-level fuel was still available if you knew where to look. Big truck stops were either empty, burned, or occupied by people I didn't want to meet. But rural farms, construction sites, and equipment depots often had bulk diesel tanks that were untouched because nobody else was thinking about them yet. I found one at a gravel quarry off Highway 25, a 500-gallon tank on a metal stand with a hand crank pump still attached. I spent 2 hours filling every container I had, which by then included the jerry can, 4 plastic jugs I'd found in a recycling bin, and the 2-gallon water jug I'd emptied and rinsed. It was slow, physical work, and I was exposed the entire time. But I filled the truck's tanks to full and had another 15 gallons in reserve. That was 2,300 miles if I was careful. That was a lot of careful. I drove south and east through the first week, not toward any specific destination, but away from the population centers I could see marked on my GPS. My logic was simple. Fewer people before meant fewer infected now. I stayed on county roads and state routes, avoiding interstates entirely after the Gridlock experience. The driving was strange. Miles of empty road, fields and forests scrolling past, the occasional house with lights on that I stared at as I passed and wondered about. Then a car across both lanes and I'd have to stop, back up, find a way around. Then more empty road. The rhythm of it was hypnotic in a way that was dangerous. I'd drift into a state that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't full alertness either, and then something would snap me back. A shape at the roadside, a sound, the feeling of being watched, which I told myself was just paranoia, but which I never fully dismissed. On the 8th day, I met the Ott brothers. I had stopped at a crossroads in rural Hancock County, Tennessee, to check my GPS and plan a route south. The intersection had a gas station, a small one, 2 pumps under a metal canopy, attached to a cinder block building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Kyle's Ford Fuel and Bait." I was sitting in the cab with the engine off, studying the map, when I heard a knock on the passenger door. Two men, both in their 30s, both lean and weathered in the way of people who work outdoors. One was taller, with a reddish beard and a Remington 870 shotgun held barrel down. The other was shorter, clean-shaven, holding a gas can. They didn't look threatening. They looked tired and cautious and human, which was somehow more alarming than if they'd looked threatening, because it meant they were thinking, and thinking people are unpredictable. I cracked the window. The taller one said, "You got fuel?" I said, "Some." He said, "We're not looking to take anything. We've got a place about 4 miles up the hollow. Farmhouse. We've got water and food, but no diesel for the generator. We can trade." The shorter one held up the gas can like evidence. I thought about it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. The arithmetic was clear. I had fuel. They had water and food. A trade made both parties stronger. But the arithmetic didn't account for what happened after the trade. Whether they'd follow me, whether others would, whether generosity would mark me as a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be dealt with. 19 years on the road had taught me to read people, and these two didn't read as dangerous. But 19 years on the road had also taught me that the people who rob you rarely look like the people who rob you. I gave them 5 gallons. I didn't ask for anything in return, and I didn't give them my name. The taller one, he said his name was Galt and his brother was Phelan, asked if I wanted to come up to the farmhouse. "Safer in numbers," he said. I told him I was heading south. He said, "South's not great either." I said I knew. Then I closed the window and drove away, and I watched them in my mirrors until the road curved and they disappeared. I've thought about that exchange more than almost anything else from the first month. Not because it was dramatic or dangerous, but because it was the first time I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be in this new world. The old world had systems for that. Laws, norms, expectations. The whole scaffolding of society that tells you what you owe people and what they owe you. The new world had nothing. There was just me and them and a crossroads and 5 gallons of diesel. And the decision I made, give, don't stay, don't connect, keep moving, said something about me that I'm still trying to understand. I think I was afraid. Not of the Ott brothers specifically, but of needing people. Needing people meant depending on them, and depending on them meant being vulnerable to their decisions. And I had spent 19 years in a truck specifically because it meant I only had to depend on myself. The apocalypse didn't change that instinct. It sharpened it. The second week was when the weather turned and the loneliness got heavy. The temperature dropped into the low 30s at night. The APU's heater worked, but it burned fuel, and I'd begun rationing more carefully after calculating that my supply wasn't as deep as I'd thought. The problem was idle time. When I was driving, the engine generated heat and the cab was warm. When I was parked, the APU could maintain maybe 55 degrees inside if I ran it continuously. But continuously meant burning a gallon an hour, and the math on that was unsustainable. So I developed a cycle. Run the APU for 2 hours, turn it off, sleep under every layer I had until the cold woke me, run it again for 1 hour, turn it off. The result was that I never slept for more than about 90 minutes at a stretch. After 4 days of this, I was so tired that I started making mistakes, leaving the parking brake off, forgetting to check mirrors before moving, once pulling onto a road without looking and nearly hitting an abandoned car that I should have seen from 100 yards. The loneliness was worse than the cold because I couldn't cycle it on and off. It was constant, and it changed shape. In the first week, it had been a simple absence. I missed conversation, missed the radio, Missed the predictable exchanges with dock workers and fuel attendants and waitresses at truck stop diners. In the second week, it became something physical. A weight on my chest when I woke up. A sound in my ears that wasn't a sound. More like the auditory equivalent of staring at a blank wall. A flatness where texture used to be. I talked to myself. Not monologues. Not narration. Just the kind of muttering that a person does when they're alone too long. Okay, where's the... Yeah, there. And... Need to check that. And... All right, Clee, come on. I talked to Bree. Not on the phone, there was still no signal. But out loud, as if she could hear me. I told her I was okay. I told her I was coming. I told her about the roads and the weather and the fuel situation, as if giving a report. I know how that sounds, I know. But when you haven't heard another human voice in 5 days, your own voice starts to feel like it belongs to someone else, and you'll do anything to make it feel like yours again. On day 11, I found a radio signal. I was parked behind a volunteer fire station in Rogersville, running the cab radio through its scan function the way I did every morning, and it locked onto a frequency, AM 1180, and a voice came through the static. It was a man, calm, reading what sounded like a prepared statement. He identified himself as part of a civilian emergency broadcast out of Knoxville and said that organized evacuation points had been established at several locations in East Tennessee. He listed them: the Knoxville Convention Center, a National Guard armory in Maryville, a high school football stadium in Sevierville. He said that military and FEMA resources were being consolidated at these points, and that survivors should make their way to the nearest one. He said to travel during daylight and avoid large groups of infected. He said the situation was being managed. I listened to the broadcast loop 3 times. Then I turned it off and sat in the quiet and thought. The obvious move was to go to one of those evacuation points. Safety in numbers, military protection, food, water, medical care, structure, everything the truck couldn't give me. But something about it felt wrong, and it took me a while to figure out what. It was the phrase, being managed. That phrase had a specific meaning in the old world. It meant that someone with authority and resources had assessed a situation and was applying a response. But I had been driving through East Tennessee for 11 days, and I had seen no evidence of management anywhere. No military convoys, no road crews, no medical teams, no power restoration. Nothing. The evacuation points might be real, but the infrastructure to sustain them was either invisible or absent. And concentrating survivors in a fixed location without that infrastructure meant concentrating the living in a place that the dead would eventually surround. I didn't go. I kept moving. Day 13 was the first time I had to use the truck as a weapon. And I don't want to describe it in detail because I don't think the detail is useful. I was driving on a county road in Granger County when I came around a curve, and there were 4 of them in the road. Not standing. Moving. Walking towards something I couldn't see. A sound maybe, or a scent. I was going about 30 miles an hour, and I didn't have room to stop or swerve on the narrow road with ditches on both sides. The truck went through them. The impacts were smaller than I expected. Not like hitting a deer, which I'd done twice in my career. More like hitting heavy bags of sand. The truck didn't slow. I didn't look in the mirrors. That night I parked in a hayfield and didn't run the APU and lay in the bunk shaking. And I couldn't tell if it was the cold or something else. The middle of the month, days 14 through 20, was the long stretch. That's the only way I can describe it. The days blurred. I drove south, then east, then south again, tracing a slow arc through the rural counties of East Tennessee and into the corner of North Carolina. I was looking for fuel and food and finding both in decreasing quantities. The easy sources were gone, either emptied by other survivors or simply inaccessible because the hand pumps had seized or the tanks had been drained to service equipment that someone else had taken. I started siphoning from abandoned vehicles, which worked but was slow and yielded small amounts. A car might have 3 or 4 gallons. A pickup might have 8 or 10. I could spend an hour working a siphon and come away with enough diesel to drive 50 miles. Food was similar. I raided houses for the first time on day 15, and I hated it. I want to be clear about that. Every house I entered had belonged to someone. Had photos on the walls, dishes in the sink, shoes by the door. I took canned goods, dry pasta, peanut butter, anything with calories that wouldn't spoil. I moved fast and touched as little as possible, and tried not to look at the personal things, because looking at them made the people real, and real people meant real losses, and I couldn't carry that weight and still function. Some houses were empty in the clean way. People had packed and left. Some were empty in the other way. I won't describe those either. On day 16, I found a dog. A blue tick hound, male, maybe 3 years old, sitting on the porch of a farmhouse with a broken front window. He was thin but not starving, and he didn't bark when I approached, which was either good temperament or exhaustion. I gave him some of the dog food I'd been carrying, and he ate it in about 45 seconds, and then he looked at me with an expression that I interpreted, probably incorrectly, as negotiation. I named him Turley, after a road I'd driven past that morning. He rode in the passenger seat during the day and slept on the floor of the sleeper at night, wedged between the bunk and the counter in the 22-inch gap that was now his. He was warm. He was alive. He smelled terrible, which I only knew because my nose had recalibrated enough to distinguish his smell from mine. He didn't bark, which was critical, but he'd make a low rumbling sound in his chest when something was outside, and that rumble became the most valuable alarm system I had. Turley changed the calculus of everything. He needed food and water, which reduced my per-day supply. He needed to be let out periodically, which meant stopping and opening the door, which meant exposure. He took up space in a cab where space was currency. He was, by any rational measure, a liability. But he was also the reason I kept doing the things that kept me alive. Driving, scavenging, planning, maintaining the truck. All of it had felt, by the middle of the second week, like mechanical repetition, habit divorced from purpose. Turley gave the habits a reason. He was depending on me, which meant I had to be someone worth depending on, which meant I had to keep going. I don't think I was suicidal before he showed up, but I think I was approaching a kind of paralysis that is the cousin of giving up, and he interrupted it. Day 19 was when I met the woman at the bridge. I was heading south on a 2-lane road that my GPS said crossed a river, the Nolichucky, I think, via a concrete bridge. As I approached, I could see that the bridge was partially blocked. A flatbed truck and a sedan were parked nose to tail across the near lane, leaving just enough room for a vehicle to squeeze past in the far lane. It looked deliberate, a checkpoint or a barricade. I stopped about 200 yards back and watched. After a few minutes, a woman came out from behind the flatbed. She was maybe 50, heavy-set, wearing a hunting jacket and carrying what looked like a lever-action rifle. She walked to the middle of the road and stood there, looking at my truck. I had a decision to make, and I had to make it fast. Turn around and find another crossing, which might be miles away and might be blocked too. Or approach and see what she wanted. I approached, slowly. I stopped about 50 feet from her and opened my window. She said, "How many in the truck?" I said, "Just me and a dog." She studied me for a long moment. Then she said, "The bridge is out on the far side, about 100 feet past where you can see. The concrete gave way 2 days ago. You can't cross." I looked past the barricade. She was right. From my elevated cab, I could see that the road surface beyond the blocked vehicles ended in a ragged edge, and beyond that, nothing. The river was maybe 40 feet below. "Is there another crossing?" I asked. "There's an old rail bridge about 6 miles upstream. You can walk it, but you can't drive it." She paused. "Why are you going south?" I didn't answer that directly. I said, "What's the situation like around here?" She told me. Her name was Netta. She lived on a farm on the south side of the river with her husband, Ferris, who was on the far side of the broken bridge and couldn't cross back because there was no other vehicle crossing for 30 miles in either direction. They'd set up the barricade to keep infected from wandering onto what was left of the bridge and falling into the river upstream of their water intake. She was staying on the north side because someone needed to maintain the barricade and because she wasn't willing to leave the truck and the car, which were their only vehicles. She asked me if I had fuel. I said some. She asked if I had food. I said some. Then she asked me something nobody had asked me yet. "Do you want to stop?" I understood what she meant. Not stop for the night. Stop. Stop driving, stop running, stop treating every mile as a unit of survival. She was offering me a place, or at least the idea of a place. Her farm, the south side of the river, a fixed location with water and land and another human being. I thought about it. I thought about it seriously, sitting in that cab with Turley's head on my thigh and Netta standing in the road with her rifle pointed at the ground. And for a moment, I felt the pull of it so strongly that my hands loosened on the steering wheel. To stop. To be somewhere. To wake up in the same place 2 days in a row and know the perimeter, and drink water from a source I'd tested, and sleep in a bed that didn't vibrate with the memory of 10,000 miles. But Bree was not on the south side of that river. Bree was in Chattanooga, or she had been. And Chattanooga was south and west, and every day I spent not moving toward her was a day I spent choosing my own comfort over my daughter. I knew, rationally, that the chance of finding her was small and shrinking. I knew that Chattanooga was a city, and cities were the worst places. I knew that she might not be there, might not be anywhere. But the not knowing was itself a kind of fuel. And I wasn't ready to let it run out. I told Netta I couldn't stay. She nodded like she'd expected that. I gave her 10 gallons of diesel, which was more than I should have, and she gave me a canvas bag with 6 cans of green beans, a jar of sourwood honey, and a box of 22 cartridges that I had no gun to use. I thanked her. She said, "If you make it back this way, the offer stands." I turned the truck around and drove north to find another route south. I never saw Netta again. I think about her and Ferris on opposite sides of that broken bridge, maintaining their barricade and their water intake and their stubborn separateness. And I hope they found a way to the same side eventually. But I don't know. The third week was the hardest. The fuel situation became critical. My main tanks were below a quarter, and the reserve containers were empty. I was rationing driving to no more than 2 hours a day, spending the rest of the time parked and hidden, which meant the cold was now the primary enemy. Temperatures at night were dropping into the mid-20s. I wore every piece of clothing I had to bed: thermal underwear, 2 pairs of socks, a flannel shirt, a hoodie, my jacket, and a knit cap. And I wrapped the wool blanket over the sleeping bag and pulled Turley up onto the bunk with me. And even then, I woke up with my fingers numb and my breath visible. On day 21, I found fuel in a way that I'm not proud of, but which I'm going to tell honestly, because there's no point in this story if I'm not honest. I came upon an RV, a Class C motorhome, a Winnebago, parked in a grocery store parking lot, in a town whose name I either never knew or have forgotten. The RV's engine was off. Its windows were curtained. I watched it for an hour from across the lot, and nothing moved. I approached on foot, Turley on a length of rope beside me, and knocked on the side door. No response. I knocked again. Nothing. I tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside there was evidence of habitation. Bedding disturbed, food wrappers, a half-empty water bottle. But no one was there. I checked every compartment. Empty. Whoever had been living in it had left, or been taken, or walked away for reasons I'd never know. The Winnebago had a 40-gallon gasoline tank, and I couldn't use gasoline in my diesel engine. But it also had a 4-gallon diesel generator mounted underneath, with its own small fuel tank that was nearly full. 4 gallons. I took them. Then I searched the rest of the RV and took what I could use. A propane camping stove, 2 small propane canisters, a fleece blanket, a box of kitchen matches, a can opener. Mine had broken 3 days earlier. 4 cans of soup, a bag of rice, and a paperback novel, a thriller by someone I'd never heard of. The novel was the most valuable thing I took, and I mean that literally. I read it over the next 4 nights by flashlight, and those were the only hours in the 3rd week when I felt like a human being rather than a machine optimizing its own survival. I also took a photograph. It was stuck to the RV's refrigerator with a magnet. A picture of a young couple standing in front of the Grand Canyon, squinting in sunlight, holding ice cream cones. I don't know why I took it. I put it in my shirt pocket and carried it for the rest of the month. And sometimes at night, I'd take it out and look at it, and try to imagine where they were, whether they were alive, whether they'd found each other if they'd been separated. The photograph was a kind of prayer, though I'm not a praying man. Day 23 brought the worst mechanical problem I'd had. The truck's air dryer, which removes moisture from the compressed air system that operates the brakes, froze. I'd been running the engine to charge the batteries, and the cold had crystallized moisture in the air lines. When I tried to move, the brakes locked. A loaded truck with frozen air brakes is a 73,000-pound paperweight. My unloaded cab was lighter, but the principle was the same. I couldn't drive. This is where the Army years paid off. I knew what was wrong, and I knew how to fix it. But the fix required heat. I crawled under the truck with the propane stove and spent 40 minutes warming the air dryer and the lines feeding into it. Carefully, because too much heat would damage the rubber seals, and too little wouldn't melt the ice. Turley stood guard above me, which in practice meant he lay down next to the front tire and went to sleep, but his presence was comforting. The stove's blue flame was the only light under the truck, and the ice crystals on the airlines glittered in it, and for a surreal moment, the underside of my Kenworth was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The brakes freed. I drove. But the incident terrified me in a way that the infected never quite had, because it revealed a category of failure I couldn't outrun or hide from. The truck was a machine. Machines break. And when this machine broke, I was immobile, exposed, and had no backup. I started doing daily maintenance checks after that. Air pressure, oil level, coolant, belt tension, tire condition. The way I'd been trained to do in the Army, but had gotten lazy about in civilian life. The routine took 20 minutes every morning and used a small amount of fuel to run the engine, but it was non-negotiable. The truck was my body. If it failed, I failed. Day 25. I was parked on a fire road in the Cherokee National Forest, deep enough in the trees that the truck was invisible from any paved road. It was mid-afternoon, and I was doing something I'd started in the third week, writing. Not a journal exactly, and not a letter, though it was addressed to Bree. More like a record. I wrote down what I'd done each day, what I'd seen, what I'd decided, and why. I wrote down the things I couldn't say out loud, because saying them out loud in an empty cab would make them too real. That I might not find her. That she might not be alive. That I might be driving in circles through a dead landscape for no reason other than the inability to stop. Turley made his sound. The low rumble, barely audible, more vibration than noise. I put down the pen and looked through the gap in the curtain. There was a man standing at the edge of the fire road, about 60 feet from the truck. He was alive, I could tell immediately, because the living and the dead move differently, in ways that are hard to articulate, but impossible to mistake once you've seen enough of both. He was standing still, looking at the truck, and he had a backpack and a hatchet in his right hand. He was young, mid-20s maybe. He was wearing a college sweatshirt and jeans and hiking boots, and he looked like he'd been sleeping outdoors for a while. He didn't approach. He just stood there, looking. I had to decide. I had been deciding all month, and every decision had been some version of the same question. How much risk am I willing to accept for the sake of being human? The Ott brothers had been a 5-gallon answer. Netta had been a 10-gallon answer and an almost stop. This was different. This was a person standing alone in the woods with a hatchet, looking at the only shelter for miles, and I was the one inside it. I opened the driver's door and stood on the step. I didn't get down. I kept one hand on the doorframe and said, "You all right?" He flinched, like he hadn't expected me to speak first. Then he said, "Yeah, no, I've been walking for a while." I asked him from where. He said Johnson City. That was about 40 miles northeast. He said his name was Everest. Last name, he said, he didn't give a first. And that he'd been a graduate student at East Tennessee State, studying something to do with forestry, and that he'd been in the field when everything happened and had been walking since. He said he hadn't eaten in 2 days. I gave him food. 2 cans of soup and a protein bar and a bottle of water. He sat on a rock at the edge of the fire road and ate with the careful slowness of someone who knew that eating too fast after a fast would make him sick. Turley went to him and let himself be scratched behind the ears, which I took as a meaningful endorsement. We talked. He told me things he'd seen. The ETSU campus had been overrun within the first 3 days. The city had burned in places. There were groups of survivors in the mountains, but they were territorial and hostile. I told him things I'd seen. It was the most I'd spoken in weeks, and my voice cracked and wandered, and I kept losing my train of thought. He asked if he could ride with me. I said yes. And even as I said it, I knew I was violating every principle I'd established for myself. The truck was sized for one. The supplies were calculated for one and a dog. The sleeper was a single bunk. Every additional person doubled the resource consumption and halved the margin. And I had been running the arithmetic all month, and the arithmetic said no. And I said yes. He climbed into the passenger seat and put his backpack on the floor. And Turley put his head on Everest's knee, and we sat there for a moment in the silence that follows a decision that can't be undone. Everest was with me for 6 days. Those 6 days, 25 through 31, were simultaneously the best and worst of the month, and I need to explain both because they're inseparable. The best. He was company. Real company. A person who answered when spoken to, who had opinions and knowledge and a different way of seeing things. He knew plants, Which ones were edible? Which ones were useful? Which ones were indicators of water or soil quality? On a scavenging stop, he identified a patch of Jerusalem artichoke growing wild behind a barn, and we dug up tubers with our hands and cooked them on the propane stove, and they tasted like the best food I'd ever eaten. Not because they were good, but because I hadn't eaten anything hot and fresh in 3 weeks. He fixed the CB radio's antenna connection, which had been loose and cutting out, and suddenly the radio worked properly again, and we picked up scattered transmissions, mostly static, but once a clear voice giving coordinates for a survivor camp somewhere in western North Carolina. He told me about his research, forest ecology, something about mycorrhizal networks, the underground fungal systems that connect trees. He said that trees in a forest aren't individual organisms competing for resources. They're nodes in a network, sharing nutrients and information through the fungi connecting their roots. A tree that's sick will receive sugars from its neighbors. A tree that's dying will dump its resources into the network for others to use. The forest isn't a collection of trees, he said. It's a single organism pretending to be separate. I thought about that at night, lying on the bunk while Everest slept in the reclined passenger seat up front, Turley on the floor between us. I thought about the Ott brothers, and Netta and Ferris, and the couple in the photograph, and Bree and me, and whether we were all nodes in a network that had been severed, reaching out through broken connections, sending resources and signals into the dark, hoping something on the other end would receive them. The worst. The space problem became acute. 2 adults and a 60-pound dog in 82 square feet. Every time I needed something from the sleeper while Everest was sitting in the cab, there was a negotiation of bodies and angles that felt like trying to fold a box inside itself. He was respectful, careful with supplies, quiet at night, willing to take any task I suggested. But his presence changed the acoustic quality of the cab in a way that I found, to my shame, almost unbearable. The sound of another person breathing, chewing, shifting, existing in a space that my nervous system had mapped as mine. It was like someone had added a frequency to a song I'd been hearing for weeks, and it clashed with everything. We talked about where to go. He wanted to head for the coordinates we'd heard on the CB. A survivor camp, maybe organized, maybe safe. I wanted to head for Chattanooga. We both knew that neither option was verifiably better than the other. And we both knew that what we were really arguing about wasn't the destination, but the nature of the journey. He wanted to arrive somewhere. I wanted to find someone. Those are different kinds of movement, and they pull in different directions. On day 27, we hit a roadblock that was different from any I'd seen before. Not abandoned vehicles, not infected. People. 5 of them, armed, standing across a 2-lane road with a pickup truck behind them. They had rifles and a hand-painted sign that read, "Toll Road, Fuel or Food." I stopped well back. Everest said, "We should turn around." I said, "They've already seen us. If we turn around, they might follow." He said, "If we go forward, they'll take what we have." We sat there for a full minute, the engine idling, 5 armed figures watching us from 300 feet away. I did something I hadn't done in 19 years of driving. I used the truck's horn. Not a tap. I laid on it. The full air horn of a Kenworth W990, 150 decibels, a sound designed to warn an entire highway. I held it for 10 seconds. The effect was immediate and double-edged. The armed group scattered, not running, but moving fast, diving behind their pickup in the roadside ditch, probably thinking it was a signal to some larger force behind me. But the sound also carried for miles in every direction, and within 60 seconds I could see movement in the tree line on both sides of the road. Shapes. The wrong kind of movement. I put the truck in gear and drove. Not fast, I couldn't on that road, but steadily, past the abandoned roadblock, past the pickup, past the ditch where the armed group was now dealing with their own problem, the one I'd just summoned for them with 150 decibels of invitation. Everest stared straight ahead and didn't speak. I stared straight ahead and drove. We were 2 miles past the roadblock before either of us said anything. Then Everest said, "You brought them down on those people." He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a fact. I said, "Yes." He said, "They would have taken our fuel." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is that enough?" I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. The arithmetic said yes. 5 strangers trying to take from us by force versus us trying to survive by movement. The horn was a tool, and I used it, and it worked. But the arithmetic didn't account for the fact that those 5 people were alive, and I might have just made them dead. And the space between might have and did is exactly the width of a moral conscience, and mine was telling me something I didn't want to hear. We drove in silence for the rest of the day. Day 29. Fuel was at its lowest point. The main tanks had maybe 30 gallons combined, 180 miles if I was lucky. The reserves were empty. The propane was down to half a canister. Food was adequate but not abundant, enough for maybe 5 more days at 2 meals per person. We hadn't found a viable fuel source in 3 days. The landscape had changed as we'd come south and west. More developed, more suburban, which meant more vehicles, but also more scavenged already. I tried siphoning from a row of cars in a Walmart parking lot and got less than a gallon total. Everest proposed something that I didn't want to hear. He said we should park the truck, take what we could carry, and walk. He said the truck was becoming a liability, too visible, too fuel-dependent, too road-constrained. On foot, we could cross terrain the truck couldn't, avoid encounters the truck attracted, and move quietly in a way that 73,000 pounds of Kenworth never could. He was right. I knew he was right. But the truck was not a vehicle to me anymore. It was my home. It had been my home for years before the outbreak, and for every day since. And the idea of walking away from it, from the bunk and the curtains and the locked doors and the engine that could put miles between me and anything, filled me with a specific dread that I can only compare to the feeling of watching the last light go out. I told him I needed to think about it. He said, "Think fast, we're burning daylight and diesel." That night, parked behind a furniture warehouse on the outskirts of some town, I lay in the bunk and thought about Bree. I did the thing I'd been avoiding for 30 days, which was to think about her honestly. She was in Chattanooga, or she wasn't. She was alive, or she wasn't. If she was alive, she was surviving. She was smart, she was practical, she was young and strong, and had a stubbornness that she got from me and that I'd been grateful for even when it drove me crazy. If she was alive, she didn't need me to rescue her. She needed me to be findable, and a truck was findable. A man on foot in the Appalachian woods was not. But findable only mattered if she was looking, and I had no evidence that she was, and the fuel to reach Chattanooga was fuel I didn't have. I made a decision. I would drive to Chattanooga. I would use every drop of fuel I had. If I found Bree, I would find Bree. If I didn't, I would park the truck in a visible location, leave a note on the dashboard with the date and direction I was heading, and walk. The truck would become a message rather than a vehicle, a marker, a breadcrumb, proof that I had been there and was still alive as of a certain date. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan I could live with. I told Everest in the morning. He listened, and then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "I'll go with you to Chattanooga." After that, I'm heading for the camp on the radio. I asked him why he'd go to Chattanooga at all if his destination was somewhere else. He said, "Because you gave me soup when I hadn't eaten in 2 days. And that cost something. And I'm not done paying it back." I didn't argue. I should have. The arithmetic said 2 people in a truck burning the last of its fuel toward a city that was almost certainly overrun was worse than 1. And Everest's chances were better on foot in the forest than they were riding with me into whatever Chattanooga had become. But I wanted the company. I wanted the second pair of eyes and the knowledge of edible plants and the sound of another person breathing in the cab. I wanted not to arrive alone. We drove. Day 30. The last day of the first month, though I didn't know yet that it was the last. I just knew it was a day with a destination. The route was I-81 south to I-40 west, which would normally have been straightforward, but nothing was straightforward anymore. We stayed off the interstates until we had to get on them, and when we did, the scale of what had happened became undeniable. The highway was a graveyard. Cars by the thousands stopped where they'd stopped, doors open, belongings scattered. Some had been there since the first week. Some were more recent. We threaded through them at walking speed, sometimes pushing cars out of the way with the truck's bumper. A slow, grinding metal-on-metal process that I hated because of the noise, but that was often the only option. The infected were thicker here. Not hordes. I never saw a horde, and I'm skeptical of people who say they did. But clusters. Groups of 10 or 20, standing or walking in the median, on the shoulders, in the fields along the highway. They reacted to the truck's engine noise, turning toward it, some of them beginning to walk in our direction. But they were slow, and we were faster, even at 5 miles an hour through the wreckage. The key was not to stop. Stopping meant they converged. Moving meant they trailed behind, unable to keep up, gradually falling back into the landscape. Chattanooga appeared on the horizon as a line of buildings against a gray sky, and my first thought was that it looked normal. No fires, no visible destruction. Just a city, quiet and still, like a photograph of a place that used to be alive. We came in from the east, on surface streets, because the interstate interchange was completely blocked. The neighborhoods we drove through were empty in the way that I'd learned to read. Some houses locked and intact, some with broken windows, some with dark stains on porches and sidewalks that I didn't look at closely. Turley was rumbling constantly, a low, continuous vibration in his chest, and Everest had my tire iron in his lap, and I was driving with both hands on the wheel and my foot hovering over the accelerator. Bree's apartment was in a complex off Brainerd Road, a 2-story building with exterior stairs and a parking lot that had been half full the last time I'd visited. I knew the address. I knew the unit number. I had been there twice, once when she moved in, once for her birthday the year before. The parking lot was empty. The building was intact. Her unit was on the 2nd floor, number 214, and from the truck, I could see that the door was closed and the curtains were drawn. I parked. I told Everest to stay in the truck with Turley and keep the engine running. He started to argue. I said, "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, drive." He looked at me for a moment and then nodded. I got out of the truck. The air smelled like cold and something chemical, maybe a gas leak somewhere, maybe something else. The parking lot was silent. I walked to the stairs and went up. The stairs were concrete and my boots were loud on them, and I tried to walk quietly and couldn't. Unit 214. The door was closed. There was a welcome mat that said, "Hi, I'm Matt," a joke gift I'd given her when she moved in. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again. I said, "Bree, it's Dad." Nothing. I tried the handle. Locked. I stepped back and kicked the door, which was a hollow core interior door that hadn't been designed to resist much, and it opened on the second kick. The apartment was empty. Not empty like the RV, not recently vacated, belongings scattered. Empty like someone had packed. The closets were open and mostly bare. The bathroom had no toiletries. The kitchen had no food. The bed was stripped. She had left, and she had left deliberately, and she had taken what mattered. On the kitchen counter, held down by a coffee mug, was a piece of paper. Bree's handwriting, small, neat, left-leaning, unmistakable. It said, "Dad, going to Aunt Colleen's. Tried calling you 100 times. I'm okay. Please come find me. I love you. B." Colleen was my sister. She lived on a farm outside of Crossville, Tennessee, about 90 miles northwest of Chattanooga. Bree had spent summers there as a kid. Colleen's place had well water, a generator, acres of land, and a root cellar that my father had built in the 70s. It was, I realized, exactly where a smart person would go. I stood in that empty apartment and read the note 4 times. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket, next to the photograph of the strangers at the Grand Canyon, and I went back down the stairs and across the parking lot and climbed into the truck. Everest said, "Well?" I said, "She's alive. She went to my sister's place. It's about 90 miles northwest." He looked at the fuel gauge. I looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was below the red line, in the territory where accuracy becomes guesswork. He said, 90 miles. I said, "Maybe we have it. Maybe we don't." He said, "One way to find out." I put the truck in gear. Turley settled onto the floor. Everest settled into the passenger seat. We drove north and west, out of Chattanooga, onto back roads that wound through the ridges and valleys of the Cumberland Plateau. And the fuel gauge didn't move because it was already as low as it could register. And I had no idea whether the engine would run for 90 miles or 9. The truck ran for 67. It coughed twice on a long uphill grade, shuddered, and died. I let it coast to the shoulder and set the parking brake, and sat there with my hands on the wheel while the cab ticked and cooled around me. Turley looked up at me. Everest looked at me. I looked at the GPS. 23 miles to Crossville. Maybe another 5 or 6 from Crossville to Colleen's place. Call it 30 miles. I want to talk about what it felt like to leave the truck, because I think it matters. I opened the door and stepped down onto the gravel shoulder, and I stood there and looked at the Kenworth. It was dirty. Weeks of road grime and mud, and a long crack in the passenger side mirror from a branch I'd clipped on a fire road. The chrome was dull. The paint was scratched. It looked exhausted, which is a strange thing to say about a machine, but it's what I felt. It had carried me for a month. It had been my walls, my floor, my ceiling, my bed. It had been the distance between me and everything that wanted to kill me. And now it was a metal shape on the side of a road, cooling in the afternoon air, and I was leaving it. I took what I could carry. The backpack Everest had brought could hold some. I made a second pack from the tarp and some bungee cords, crude but functional. Food, water, the propane stove, the knife, the flashlight, Bree's note, the photograph, the matches. I left the microwave, the tools I couldn't carry, most of the clothes, the logbook. I left a note on the dashboard as I'd planned. Cleland Royce, day 30, heading to Crossville, alive. We walked. Turley walked between us, his nose working constantly, his ears rotating like satellite dishes. The road was quiet. The afternoon was cold and clear, and the trees on both sides were bare, November skeletal, and our footsteps on the asphalt were the only sound. 30 miles is a long walk. On flat ground, at a steady pace, it's about 10 hours. On hilly terrain, carrying weight, with the need to stay alert and occasionally leave the road to avoid infected or questionable situations, it's longer. We walked through the rest of that day and into the night, and at some point the moon came up, 3/4 full, and lit the road silver. And I thought about something Everest had said about trees being connected underground. And I thought about Bree writing that note and leaving it on the counter, trusting that I would come, trusting that the connection between us was strong enough to survive the collapse of everything that had carried the signal before. We slept for 3 hours in a storage shed behind a church. Not well, but enough to keep moving. Everest took first watch, and I took second. And during my watch, I sat with Turley in the shed doorway and watched the road and thought about nothing, which was a luxury I hadn't had in a month. In the morning, we walked the last 12 miles. The terrain was familiar. I'd driven these roads visiting Colleen, and even on foot, even with everything changed, I recognized the curves and the hills and the way the land opened up as you came down off the plateau toward Crossville. We passed through the edge of town without incident. It was empty in the clean way. People had left. Some had probably gone to the evacuation points. Some had probably gone to places like Colleen's. Some had probably gone nowhere. Colleen's road was a gravel lane off the county route, unmarked, climbing gently for about a mile through mixed hardwood forest to a clearing where the farmhouse sat. I knew the mailbox. A black rural box on a wooden post with Royce painted on the side in white letters that Colleen repainted every spring. The mailbox was still there. The gravel lane was still there. We turned onto it and walked, and with every step, the possibility that this was real, that Bree was here, alive, waiting, grew heavier, because the alternative was something I couldn't put down if I picked it up. We came around the last curve and the farmhouse was there. White clapboard, green roof, porch across the front, smoke coming from the chimney. Smoke. Someone was home. Someone was burning wood in the fireplace, and the smoke was rising straight up into the still November air. I stopped. Everest stopped. Turley stopped. We stood in the gravel lane and looked at the house. And then the front door opened, and a woman came out onto the porch. And she was not Bree. She was Colleen. Older than I remembered, thinner, wearing a flannel shirt and holding a coffee cup. And she saw me, and the cup slipped from her hand and broke on the porch boards. And she said my name. Then another figure appeared in the doorway behind her. Taller, younger. Hair pulled back the way she'd worn it since she was 14. Bree. She came off the porch and across the yard at a run, and I dropped the makeshift pack and met her halfway. And I held my daughter in my arms for the first time in 2 months. And she was solid and warm and real. And she was crying, and I was crying, and Turley was barking. The first time he'd barked in the entire time I'd known him. And Everest stood at the edge of the yard with his hands in his pockets, watching, giving us the space. I want to tell you that it felt like the end, like resolution, like the music swelling, like the credits about to roll. But it didn't. It felt like day 31 was going to come, and then day 32, and the world was still broken, and the dead were still walking, and the fuel was gone, and the truck was sitting on a shoulder 67 miles away, cooling into the landscape. Nothing was resolved. The farm had well water and a generator and a root cellar, but it also had a perimeter that needed watching, and mouths that needed feeding, and a future that didn't exist yet, and would have to be built from whatever we could find. But Bree was alive. And I was alive. And Colleen was alive. And Everest was alive. And Turley was alive and barking. And we were standing in a yard in Tennessee in November. And the chimney was smoking. And there was a house with a door that closed and a roof that held. And we were together. Everest stayed for 2 days. Then he packed his bag and told me he was heading for the coordinates from the CB broadcast, the survivor camp in western North Carolina. I gave him food and the propane stove and the box of 22 cartridges that Netta had given me. He shook my hand. He scratched Turley's ears. He said, "Take care of the network." I think he meant the people. I think he meant the trees. I watched him walk down the gravel lane until the curve took him. I've been asked since then what the lesson was, what I learned. People want a lesson from survival stories, some clean insight, some principle that reduces a month of fear and filth and loneliness to a sentence you could put on a poster. I don't have one. What I have is this. The sleeper cab of a Kenworth W990 is 82 square feet. A can of pinto beans has about 650 calories. Diesel fuel weighs a little over 7 pounds per gallon. A blue-tick hound named Turley doesn't bark unless it matters. A note on a kitchen counter can carry more weight than a loaded trailer. And the distance between being alone and being with people is not measured in miles. It's measured in the willingness to open the door. That's what I have. That's what the first month taught me. Not a lesson, just arithmetic. The arithmetic of staying alive long enough to reach the people who make being alive worth the effort.